Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to Sustainable Outlook. I'm Elizabeth Crouse, partner and co-lead of the Power Group at K&L Gates. In this episode, the second of a two-part series, I interview Grace Russell of Acorn International. Like her colleague, Clarita Montant, who I interviewed in the first half of this series, Grace works with companies in the traditional energy sector to help them engage on the intersection of social and environmental issues. Grace is a biologist and environmental consultant with a particular focus on marine ecology and policy, which brings a unique scientific background to her work, community impact. Grace, thanks so much for joining us today. To kick things off, could you please tell us a little bit about why environmental justice is a concern in the energy industry?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me here. So I think first when I would define environmental justice, and when I think of environmental justice, I am thinking of disproportionate environmental impacts on vulnerable or marginalized communities, especially when that is part of or reflective of historic inequalities. I think the other thing that's really important for me to think of as a biologist when I'm thinking about environmental justice is to keep it grounded in the idea that humans and the environment are very, very connected, and that for companies, for society, it's very, very easy to think of environmental and social impacts as completely separate. But I think really these are not separate issues at all. So energy companies, I think, encounter this in their broad risk management and permitting frameworks. They're very, very good at evaluating environmental and social impacts separately. They build environmental management plans, and they do environmental assessments, and they do social assessments, and they do social management plans. But there's oftentimes this gap in the middle where something like a topic like environmental justice or ecosystem services really fills. So I think some of the issues that we think of when we think of environmental justice are ones that perhaps our listeners are very familiar with: climate change and disproportionate impacts on coastal communities or poor nations, sea level rise, pollution. But I think environmental justice can really go beyond that, especially in the energy industry. So topics such as siting, where you are putting your facility and the relative distance to sensitive communities and how those communities are impacted by emissions or pollution or noise or traffic. That can fall under that environmental justice umbrella. Also things like tax revenue. A lot of times major developments will negotiate tax abatements or tax agreements with the local tax authorities. And depending on where that funding can go, that may ultimately impact education or social mobility for those communities who are near these facilities. That can also be kind of under that environmental justice umbrella. Even things like truck traffic, if you're in an oil field in a rural area, and it may be the elderly or the poor or these otherwise perhaps more vulnerable or sensitive communities and groups who are bearing the brunt of that. And then I think finally the last sort of aspect of environmental justice that I see is kind of linked into the energy industry. It's about decision making, and it's about what communities are getting to express their views and make their voices heard around project siting or project design or permitting. How are they being listened to? Are they being consulted? And are they just kind of falling through the cracks in these decision-making processes? I think it's especially important to think about the decision-making when you're looking at a project that's been going on and has been existed for some time, and that there are communities who have been experiencing impacts, who might be experiencing impacts in the future as well. And I think it's important to consult those communities and make sure that they are having their voice heard in consideration of future projects as well as the past.
It's interesting that you're talking about sort of community consultations, because my understanding, and I am no environmental lawyer, but my understanding is that in a lot of jurisdictions, there are consultation processes, there are notice processes, at least to a certain extent, and on certain projects. And I mean, that sort of brings us to the point, there are laws about environmental justice, but I kind of wonder maybe if enforcement happens or to what extent. And of course, not all jurisdictions have laws in the books. In what parts of the world do you see the most need for a focus on environmental justice? And also, what parts of the world do you see people focusing the most on environmental justice too?
So I think much of my experience in the environmental justice field is here in the U.S. Gulf Coast, and I know that I think that's an area that a lot of people think of when they think of environmental justice, and certainly it's not a new issue here. It's very, very visible. Onshore petrochemical plants, they're very large, they're everywhere, and they're oftentimes sited right in the middle of minority communities or otherwise vulnerable communities. Another issue that we see is coastal erosion and the impacts to coastal Louisiana. And this is more and more visible, and it's impacting not only cities who are having to plan, are they moving? Are they investing money in infrastructure? But it's also impacting the traditional ways of life in the communities of people who have these incredibly deep generational ties to the land. So I think the biggest challenge, at least in the Gulf Coast in terms of enforcement, is the idea of cumulative impacts. And this is something that we see at Acorn in our work as well on environmental impact assessments and social impact assessments as well. Cumulative impacts are really, really challenging. But here in the Gulf Coast, it's because there's just been generations of activities of a lot of different energy companies who have been impacting the environment. So we'll see this in places where there's a lot of different petrochemical plants right in close proximity, and where there might be other heavy industry also right next to those. And so it can be a real challenge to kind of enforce any type of environmental justice legislation when you can't necessarily identify, who is the responsible party. If you have all of these chemical plants very close together, well, who is it who's responsible for the collective emissions in the area? We see this in the coastal Louisiana. There's been decades and decades of pipelines and channels and dredging being cut through wetlands, and that is one mechanism by which this coastal erosion is happening. But when companies come and go over the years, and when assets change hands, again, that leaves that question of who is responsible and what are they actually responsible for, and how do you measure how far their impacts spread? And I think all of those, apart from the consultation, it's easy to say, is a company talking to XYZ groups, but really measuring, I think, the depth of that consultation and just kind of how far some of the indirect impacts, that can also be a big challenge in the enforcement question.
So that's interesting. I mean, particularly considering cumulative impacts, and as you pointed out, assets change hands and companies change, and how do you figure out who did what? Mm-hmm. And I guess that sort of raises the question of, particularly in an industry like this where assets do change hands fairly frequently, what role do you play in your client's business? And when do you get involved? Why are they coming to you? Are you looking at the same plant 10 times in 10 years? How does this work?
It's a good question. And I think, there's a number of different ways in which we interact with companies. So very broadly speaking, we like to say we help good companies be good neighbors. Ultimately, we help them manage risk, environmental and social risk, both to their businesses and to the kind of environment and social setting in which they're operating. Again, which are very, very closely connected because, as we've discussed, environment and people are really not that far apart. So a lot of our work does involve new developments, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we're working on expansions of existing projects as well. Companies might come to us if they need to do an assessment in order to get a permit, if there's some legal or regulatory reason why they need to do these kind of risk management activities. Sometimes companies will come to us for environmental and social management because of corporate requirements. There's a lot of the, especially oil and gas companies, but not entirely. I mean, mining, other extractive industries as well, even renewables, will have corporate requirements for how they are going to manage their environmental and social impact. Sometimes those requirements even call out environmental justice separately. And so they may come to us in order to help them meet their requirements, which in some parts of the world are actually more stringent than, say, national law. And other times companies will come to us when there's a specific issue that they want help managing, be it they need to develop a corporate strategy, or they have a specific environmental or social challenge that they are seeing at one specific asset. So I think broadly speaking, kind of bringing this back to the environmental justice question, is that I think there is some movement towards seeing environmental justice as another piece of this broader kind of environmental and social risk management framework. It's not just a way to be, kind of a warm and fuzzy and socially responsible, but environmental justice considerations could be a risk that really should be managed the same way a company would manage other risks. So again, kind of bringing that back to sort of global trends around environmental justice and risk management, I think we are seeing a trend of companies applying these standards kind of universally and globally, and realizing that these issues don't just pop up in the places where you might expect them to, or in areas that might be considered high risk. We are seeing companies, for instance, conducting human rights assessments that they might normally conduct in areas where perhaps slavery is a big issue, but they're applying these same kind of corporate requirements to do a human rights impact assessment in the U.S. as well, and in the Gulf Coast as well. And so I think we are beginning to see more of the idea that kind of global risk management is beneficial.
It's interesting. I think one of the things about ESG, right, which is such a hot topic these days, is that at its core, it's really about risk management. It's really about thinking about the long term and the comprehensive, thinking about externalities, as you talk about in like finance, and incorporating some of those costs into the business, because it helps you to be able to ascertain what the long term looks like. It's interesting that people are starting to think about environmental justice in that way also. Thank you for that observation. I want to push a little bit though on something that you said earlier. You said that environment and community are very much intertwined, and I think that's probably true. But that raises sort of a question about the role that you all play, because of course Acorn International is largely focused on justice and justice issues, justice-related issues. But you're a biologist, and obviously the environment is a big part of this. Are you all out there looking at the environmental data, the technical data also, or are you working alongside other people in that respect?
We do a little bit of both, and it is interesting. I mean, people say, oh, "Grace, you're a biologist. What are you doing with these social things?" But there's so many ways in which the environment impacts the people, and the people impact the environment. And maybe this is my little soapbox, but I think it's really difficult to separate the two of them. So your question about data and what it is we do, I think is a good one, because we do that, but we also are very aware at Acorn about what we don't know, and when we need to bring in other people to partner with. I think as Clarita mentioned, we have local partners all over the world, and these may be other consulting firms, they may be local experts, independent researchers, sometimes attorneys or scientists or human rights experts. And so if we are presented with a project in some corner of the world that we don't have direct firsthand experience with, we can call up these local partners, and then ultimately the client benefits from having that local on the ground firsthand direct knowledge, but also the international perspectives that we bring. So I think that's one way in which we work with other people, be that on the data or be that on the kind of the human sides of things, and we'll build teams that are specific to the project. For instance, at the moment, we're working on a mining project in Brazil. This is a mine expansion, and so one of the questions there is about ecosystem services and evaluating the cumulative impacts on ecosystem services and the way that those are affecting indigenous people. And so we are working with not just Brazilian biologists to evaluate these ecosystem services, but Brazilian biologists who are in that corner of Brazil and studying that environment specifically. So we can get kind of as precise and localized knowledge as we can to help evaluate these impacts. I think it kind of raises an interesting question, though, looking at partnership with different groups from a different perspective. And sometimes we'll do this in the context of projects with their clients as well, and kind of bringing together different teams of professionals who might be involved in the project development. As an example, several years ago, we did a marine environmental risk assessment for a petrochemical facility in Africa. And part of that was a workshop where we had, in the same room discussing risks and mitigations and impacts. We had the marine mammal people and the coral people and the bird people, but also the water engineers and the waste management people and the kind of the technical corporate risk people, as well as the engineers from several different companies. And really, that was incredibly beneficial because it allowed this discussion of mitigation measures that really helped kind of everybody meet in the middle and kind of understand where everybody was coming from. I as a biologist don't always understand why the engineers are doing what they're doing, and the engineers might not understand why I'm asking the questions that I'm asking. But being able to kind of bring all of those groups of people together into one room, I think really helped to, give a better and more comprehensive and more actionable, mitigation plan going forward. So I think kind of bringing together those groups of people in that project development process can be, as early as possible, can be very beneficial. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where you can't necessarily evaluate impacts until you know what's done, but you can't always design mitigations until you know what the impacts are. But early communication, I think, is between different teams. I think for any project development can be incredibly beneficial.
It's great. Thank you for that. Environmental justice has been a really hot button issue in recent years, and you've noted that several times. And everything from diversity and equity and inclusion to pollution has been discussed in this context. And, things are changing too, as you observed, right? Attitudes towards environmental justice are shifting more and more to looking at it from a risk management perspective. So given the changes in the industry, given the changes in focus that people have right now, what do you think the energy industry will be focusing on in regard to environmental justice in 3 years?
It's a really good question. And I mean, from my position, I see this as being very kind of tied into broader societal awareness of diversity, equity, inclusion, and, say, disproportionate impacts on people of color. And so I think there's a kind of a societal and a corporate awareness and pressure on project developers to address those challenges, I think, is only going to increase. But I think that's not only going to be something that developers in the extractive industries are going to experience. I think broadly this is going to be something that it's a discussion that's going to continue throughout the energy transition. In some ways, an energy transition towards renewables or non-petroleum energy could be kind of seen as a way to address some environmental justice issues, but I think it's important to realize that that's not going to be the answer. So I think more and more, renewable energy developers, even kind of traditional oil and gas companies who are getting into things like carbon capture and storage, are going to have to continue to address environmental justice issues. Renewable energy industry is the challenges that they face and the challenges that their communities experience are going to be different than the petroleum industry, certainly. They're going to have to be aware of this in order to kind of get ahead of those issues, especially as some of the kind of the novelty of, say, a renewable energy boom kind of wears off. So I think certainly just the awareness of environmental justice and just the need to kind of keep centering that and for companies to recognize it's a real issue that's not going to go away. It's not just a trendy buzzword. I think is very important.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.